your life on me. Yeah, yeah. Let it shine. Thankful for this life, cause it was
Yo,
never
welcome to
mine.
Black
Prophecy
Man
got me
Thoughts.
thinking ahead of time. Slaves and nine yokes singing, swing low, sweet chariot. Through all that oppression, he was there with us. It's like he sending
What's
angels
that,
for
Derek
like
Ibar?
on their heritage. Separate the wheat and tares. Tell them about their curses so they be aware. Yeah, the spirit in you is priceless. Consider the lilies. They more great than Solomon in all of his glory. Appreciate creation, that's my favorite part of the story. Straighten up your crown, king. Go and tell our people about him. Do work if you able-bodied. This my gift, it ain't a hobby. And it's obvious. Looking at Deuteronomy like, this might be us. And this could be our last shot. It's no better time than right now. Remember in your lifetime, you should let your light shine. Just a little light, I'ma let it shine. Alright. This is the moment I waited for my home.
Yo, again, welcome to Black Man's Thoughts. You know, obviously we had a lot of information on the past podcasts, and we had a lot of stuff that's been going on since then. Um, you know, first and foremost, I like to give all praise to the Creator. You know, as an Israelite, I just want to say, you know, there's nothing that can happen or will happen without Him. So Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Elohanu, Yahweh Akkad. There was only one. There was only Yahweh. So with that said, man, I just pray, you know, that He bless us. But yo, let's get it in, man. You know, I had a good week. I can't complain. You know, and you know, I just feel blessed that I'm alive today. We have a lot of stuff happening in our history. Um, a lot of stuff happening in our history that we're living in a time that you know we should be proud of. You know, it's funny because in the like back in 2006, 2007, I used to talk to my brother Belanta Baruso, and I used to say, you know, I wonder what it'd be like to live in the 60s. I wonder what it'd be like to live in the 70s and or slavery. And it's kind of like we're living in the 60s again. We're kind of living in those eras where we have that opportunity to, you know, voice our uh voice our feelings, voice our, you know, our emotions and concerns, and really fight for what we believe in. You know, so I just, you know, it's funny because, you know, growing up you hear everything repeats itself. Well, the '60s is definitely repeating itself, man. Um, hold on, my computer literally just went off screen. I don't know if y'all can still see me. I don't know what just happened. Okay, I'm back. I'm back. So you know, hopefully nothing got messed up. But yeah, man, let's start it off, man. Uh this is uh this is global news. This is from the website Global News. Fourth black person found dead by hanging in the US. Authorities suspect suicide. This is June 17th, 2020. For at least the fourth time in less than a month, a black person has been found dead by hanging in the United States, which authorities have once again ruled a suspected suicide. The teenager's death comes shortly after three other men were found dead by hangings that were also initially ruled suicides, coincidentally, right? Which have drawn suspicion from activists amid the ongoing wave of racism demonstrations. The Harris County Sheriff's Office said Tuesday that the victim was found dead in the parking lot of a Herrick Elementary School in Springs, Texas, which lies north of Houston. Based on security video, witnesses, and other evidence, preliminary indications are the male hanged himself. The sheriff's office said on Twitter. There are currently no signs of foul play, it added. An office official cause of death has yet to be determined pending an autopsy. In California, Harsh, a 38-year-old black man was found hanged from a tree on May 31st in Victorville, just 72 miles away from Palmdale. The body of 24-year-old Robert Fuller was discovered on June 10th, also hanged from a tree. A day before Fuller was found, Dominic Alexander, 27, was discovered in the same manner in Fort Tryon Park in Upper Manhattan. New York City's medical examiner's office concluded Alexander's death was a suicide on Monday. The family of Fuller and Harsh have disputed officials' initial findings that foul play was not suspected, prompting the two separate sheriff's offices to vow to continue their investigation as potential homicides. The FBI, U.S. Attorney's Office in the Central District of California, and the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division are also monitoring those investigations, authorities said in a statement on Monday. So I'll just stop right there. Uh, this is 2020. This is 2020. And I'm reading this to y'all on Juneteenth. The concept there is that even though it's Juneteenth, we got 4 people hung before Juneteenth. So it's going to come into a lot of discussion on what we're going to speak to. But I will say this. How can you prove that a person hanged himself versus somebody who hung him? If there was no marks or bruises on the body, you don't know for sure on how he was hanged.
That one say got video.
You can't say that he hung himself just because there was no marks, just because there was no other evidence at the scene of the crime. How would you determine if he hung himself? It's obviously, we know what time it is, family. We know what time it is, and we understand that who we're dealing with and what we're dealing against. And these brothers, man, and just my thoughts, this isn't an official. All 4 of these brothers didn't do that to themselves. Especially, I think 2 of those were like in close proximity to each other. No, you take the information as it is, you look it up for yourselves. But I just wanted to bring this out before we get into anything else, because if we talk about Black Lives Matters, we talk about marching, 1 million man marches, but we don't talk about the 4th Black person found dead by hanging in the United States of America during these Black protests, you know what time it is. You know what I'm saying? So I definitely want to bring that out. Wanted to cause an awareness to that. Tweet it, Facebook it, Instagram it. Cause awareness to this, man, and be careful when y'all coming and going. You know what I mean? Because you don't know what you're up against. Just because you see protests in your cities, but you know, for every action, there's a reaction. Just understand that, you know, there's going to people that's going to respond to the protests. Don't be afraid. The Most High did not give us the spirit of fear, but just be prepared. Understand what you're dealing with, who you're up against. You get what I'm saying? So I definitely wanted to bring that out, man, as a respect to the families about that. But, you know, the big thing we wanted to talk about today, obviously, is Juneteenth. But before we do that, what if, okay, as an Israelite, is it something that Israelites should, you know, something that we should really celebrate? Is it something that we should really focus on? That because we don't celebrate birthdays, we don't celebrate Christmas, none of the man-made holidays. So what about Juneteenth? What about Juneteenth? That's not the Most High. That's not, you know, why 23. I get it. I agree. It's not Riker 23. And the only reason why we celebrated that is because we're in a situation that we never should have been into, slavery. But if we know that the Most High is in control of all things, and on this day, He gave us an official law in the land of our captivity that we are no longer to be beaten, it is something to we should remember. We should look at and say, okay, on this day, this is when y'all said that we were supposedly be free. That is something if we go to court, we can say on this day, X, Y, and Z, etc., etc. So we can't really dismiss this date just because it's not in Torah. Because it is a day that we have to remember so we can have it in the back of our mind just in case we ever have to go to court. You get what I'm saying? We don't celebrate July 4th. Nothing happened on July 4th. We were still in chains and beaten on July 4th. But Juneteenth, this is the day. Well, we'll get into that later on. But I just think that as Israelites, no, we're not supposed to put a whole lot of stock in this. You know what I mean? Because we understand that our days is our days. We have our own culture. And this day is nothing compared to our culture. You know what I mean? We have Pesach. We have Feast of Unleavened Bread. We have, you know what I mean, Shavuot, Yom Torah. We have these days. But if this is a day that my ancestors weren't physically abused or said that they weren't physically abused and were considered free on this particular day, I have to remember that in the back of my mind so I can come against my oppressors and say, on this day, you even said that. So there are certain times when you do have to acknowledge certain things because it does help you out, because it does protect you. You know what I mean? If this is a day that saved any of our black people, then I think that we should really, really, really consider in our minds and say, how can we use this to our benefit? Because if Yahweh is in control of all things, He's in control on what happens on these days as well. You get what I'm saying? So it's not something that I think that we should go out of our way for. But at the same time, I think we do need to remember because there's a facts and the matter is as we go continue to go on, 1865, you know, I wouldn't say it was the salvation for us. I can say that. And as we go on, we're going to continue to learn about that. So let me read this. This is I just pulled up something, this regular something. This is from the Vox website. Okay. Juneteenth, a holiday's 155-year history. Okay. This was posted June 18th, just yesterday, 2020. The holiday's 155-year history holds a lot of meaning in the fight of black liberation today. Okay. Juneteenth marks the day, 1865, when a group of enslaved people in Galveston, Texas, finally learned that they were free from the institution of slavery. But woefully, this was almost whoa, this was all 2.5 years after President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The Civil War was still going on, and when ended, Union Major General Gordon Granger traveled to Texas, issued an order stating that all enslaved people were to be free, establishing a new relationship between former masters and slaves as employer and hired labor. As much as Juneteenth represents freedom, it also represents how emancipation was tragically delayed for enslaved people in the deepest reaches of the Confederacy. So, in 1965, that's when the brothers in Galveston, Texas finally learned. But it was 2 years already. He already signed it. I think he signed it in like 2001 or 2003, I'm sorry, 1863, 62 or something around there. But these brothers didn't know about it until 65, it says, right? Okay, establishing a relationship between former masters and slaves. Now, I want you to be honest with that. What type of relationship do you think that these people had? Do you think it was an equal rights relationship? You think that these slave masters who wasn't doing shit and allowing and making these brothers and raping these women and brothers all these years, all of a sudden, because this was passed, you think that they were just treating these people right? Keep that in mind. As much as Juneteenth represents freedom, it also shows how emancipation was delayed. Okay, enslaved people in the deepest, richest reaches of the Confederacy. Newly freed Black people celebrated the first Juneteenth in 1866 to commemorate liberation with food, singing, and reading of spirituals. I wonder what those spirituals were, and take pride in their progress. But a century and a half later, Juneteenth still not taught in most schools, nor is the event at federal holiday dispute at event, nor is the event a federal holiday, despite decades of pushing from activists. In 1980, Texas became the first state to declare Juneteenth an official holiday. In 2020, Washington, D.C., and nearly every state recognized the day as a holiday or an observance. While Juneteenth celebrations span the world, the global diaspora has adopted the day as to recognize emancipation at large. The calls for Juneteenth to be a national holiday have grown stronger amid a climate seeking justice for Black lives. Okay, so we're not going to get into Nike and all these other stuff. You know what I mean? We're gonna go a little bit before that. It says during the Civil War, the U.S. Congress passed the Convocation Act in 18. Listen to me. The Convocation Act of 1862, which authorized Union troops to seize Confederate property, including enslaved people. The act also allowed the Union Army to recruit Black soldiers. Much later, the nation approached its third year of the Civil War. President Lincoln, on January 1st, 1863, would affirm the aims of the act by issuing the final draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. The document declared that all persons held as slaves are free and henceforth shall be free. So this was in 1863 that the final draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? That they would be considered free. In 1863, the proclamation legally freed millions of enslaved slaves in the Confederacy, but it exempted those in the Union loyal border loyal border states of Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. These states held Confederate sympathies and could be succeeded. Lincoln attempted exempted them from the proclamation to prevent this. In 1864, the Senate attempted to close this loophole while passing the 13th Amendment, prohibiting slavery and and involuntary servitude in all states, Union and Confederate. But the amendment wouldn't be enacted by ratification until 1865 of December in December. So if I would go up, it says that in 1863, it legally freed millions of enslaved people in the Confederacy, but except those Union loyal borders states of Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. It wasn't until 1865, after passing the 13th Amendment, that it would prohibit slavery and involuntary servitude in the states. So it was 2 years after that there's some other states that they were still having it. Okay. And though the Civil War ended in April 1865, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Virginia, enslaved people in Texas didn't learn about their freedom until June 19th, 1865. On that day, almost 2.5 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Can you imagine that, man? Could you imagine that? I mean, to be honest with you, I don't think much changed, but 2 years you're just working after this man signed this. I mean, that's a deep thing, man. Okay, on that day, almost 2.5 years after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, General Ma- General Major General Gordon Granger of the Union Army arrived in Galveston and issued General Order Number 3 that secured the Union's Army's authority over Texas. The order stated, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of persons, rights, and rights of property between former masters and slaves. The connection hitherto existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either either there or elsewhere. That's a lot in that information. That's a lot in there. But for time, I'm gonna move on, man. But to me, it still seems like definitely a raw deal for those that was freed. But anyway, let me move on, man, because I'll be all day on that one. The order reveals how slavery slowly raveled as an institutionally in the early 1800s. Okay, let me skip down. That's where I stop right there. Um, it's a lot of information. I don't feel like reading, but 1865 is definitely when the last. I would say the last state. I don't know if that's historically true, but it seems like the last state, Texas, was um made no no they made known to Texas that these brothers is free. 1865, and it's just the same that in 1863 it actually was signed, but obviously it was still going on, and that shows you the type of wickedness that we were dealing with. Okay, hold on. One thing I wanted to talk about is let me see if I can pull it up for you guys. Bear with me. What do you think how life was for you know for brothers that were once it was done, because we have a concept that we were freed and life is peachy, and that's far from the truth. That really is far from the truth, and that was the reason why I definitely wanted to talk about this right here, because we have to use common sense, right? So let's just think 1619, let's just say that day, because obviously there were historical documents that put us there in the 1500s easily, in the 1500s, maybe even the 1400s, but definitely the 1500s. So from 1500s all the way to the 1865, when black people are technically free, think about the mindset that they had and think about the mindset that the white people had. Do you think that they just magically said, oh, we're equal people? Think about that concept. Think about that concept on how did Americans versus African Americans, the mindset. Do you think that all of a sudden they thought that you were so special or that you were worth anything? So we just found out at 1865 that's when emancipation was done, right? So during Reconstruction, this is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The civil during Reconstruction, civil right. The Congress passed several statutes statutes aimed at protecting the rights of the newly freed slaves. Many of them over the veto of President Andrew Johnson. One such law was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which declared that all people born in the United States were U.S. citizens and had certain inalienable rights, including the rights to make contacts, to own property, to sue in court, and to enjoy the full protection of the law. So if we pause right there, I think they signed it in like um just think sometime in 1965 after it was passed. At those months, again, how do you think that these white people really looked at those slaves still? Okay. In April 9th, 1866, remember that's 4 months since January to, so still, this is a long time. This is, well, I wouldn't say a long time, but this is a few months. They had to come up with a law. So the conversation is, I wonder what made them say we have to come up with a law to even do this. Do you think that there was hangings, lynchings, mass murders going on, frustration from these white people committing brutal acts to the point where even Congress had to say, yo, we have to do this because injustice is happening. We have to give these people who are supposedly free a right to sue. Think about it. Think about the mindset that is going on within the people, right? The act gave the U.S. District Courts executive jurisdiction over criminal cases related to violations of the act and concurrent jurisdiction along the U.S. civil courts of all civil and criminal cases affecting those who were unable to enforce in state courts the rights guaranteed by the act. The Rights Act began a gradual transformation of the federal courts into the primary forms for individuals to enforce their constitutional statutory rights. So just this, keep this in context, because as we go down, we're going to just talk about certain topics. Okay. Sorry, man. Okay. So again, think about 1865. Okay. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, and slavery's end meant newfound freedom from African Americans. During the period of Reconstruction, some 2,000 African Americans held government jobs. The Black family, the Black church, and education were the central elements in the lives of post-emancipation for African Americans. Many African American lives in desperate rural poverty across the South in the decades following the war. Okay. For African Americans in the South, life after slavery is a world transformed. Gone were the brutalities and indignities of slave life, the whippings and sexual assaults, the selling and forcible relocations of family members, the denial of education, wages, legal marriages, home ownership, and more. African Americans celebrate their newfound freedom both privately and in public jubilees. In life in the years after slavery also proved to be difficult. Although slavery was over, the brutalities of white race prejudice persisted. After slavery, state governors across the South instituted laws known as Black Codes. These laws guaranteed certain legal rights to Blacks, including the right to marry, own property, and sue in court. But the codes also made it illegal for Blacks to serve on juries, testify against whites, or serve in state militias. Black codes also required Black sharecroppers and tenant farmers to sign annual labor contracts with white landowners. If they refused, they could be arrested and hired out for work. Hired out for work means slavery. Okay? Yeah, that what it say, they could sue, but they couldn't have none of their Black people to testify against the white people. You see, it's a catch-22. A lot of that's still going on because if you look at the jurors, 99% of all jurors, I don't think I've ever seen an all Black juror with one white person. It's always that all white drawer with one or two black people. That's facts. That's facts. You can't tell me that there was ever a case when the majority of the drawer was black people with with the black judge, but it's supposed to be of your peers. What about in states and in cities that's majority black? How the hell you still get more white people on the drawer? Okay? Most Southern Black Americans, though free, live in desperate rural poverty, having been denied education and wages under slavery. Ex-slaves were often forced by the necessity of their economic circumstances to rent land from former white slave owners. These sharecroppers paid rent on the land by giving a portion of their crop to the landowner. So basically, yeah, you free, but you're not free because you're still going to work on the land that's not yours, that you can't own. And you're still going to have to give a lot of what you do to the real landowner. Okay? In a few places in the South, former slaves seized land from former slave owners in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, but federal troops quickly restored the land to white landowners. Remember the start of policing, right? What did it say? Former what? Troops quickly restored the land to white slave owners. The movement among Republicans in Congress to provide land to former slaves were unsuccessful. Let me say that again. The movement among Republicans in Congress to provide land to former slaves were unsuccessful. Former slaves were never compensated for their enslavement. Every other group has, though. Let me continue. Faith, family, and education. Family, church, and school became centers of black life after slavery. Even with slavery's end, black women preferred to be homemakers. Okay. Black churches became centerpieces of African American culture and community. Okay. Black ministers were community leaders. African Americans' desire for education found expression in the establishment of schools at every level, from grade school to basic education to the founding of the nation's first black colleges, such as Fisk and Howard. The Freedmen's Bureau, a government agency established to aid former slaves, oversaw some 3,000 schools across the South and ran hospitals and healthcare facilities for freedmen. Mm, that's a lot of information, man. There's a lot of history that I think that we don't look at, and we don't pay attention to, man. But I don't know. I think that's pretty interesting. Let's look at the Freedmen's Bureau because we talking about the Freedmen's Bureau. What is the Freedmen's Bureau? The Freedmen's Bureau, formerly known as the Bureau of Refugees, freedmen in abandoned lands, were established in 1865 by Congress to help millions of former black slaves and poor whites in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War. The Freedmen's, huh? And poor whites, and yep. So now they poor. The Freedmen's Bureau provide food, housing, and medical aid. That sounds like SSI and food stamps, right? Welfare. The Freedmen's Bureau provided food, housing, and medical aid, established schools, and offered legal assistance. It also attempted to settle former slaves on land confiscated or abandoned during the war. However, the Bureau was prevented from fully carrying out its program due to the shortage of funds and personnel, along with the politics of race and Reconstruction. The creation of the Bureau, the Freedmen's Bureau, was established by an act of Congress on March 3rd, 1865, 2 months Robert, before Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to the Union. So yeah, definitely. That's what the Freedmen's Bureau was. Sorry. Yeah, basically it seems like it was just like more of a welfare to help people get up on their feet. Sorry, my phone. Acting up. Okay. During the period of Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 to 1877, Congress passed and enforced laws that promoted civil and political rights for African Americans across the South. Most notable, the laws among the laws Congress passed were the three amendments in the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed African Americans the rights of American citizenship, and the 15th Amendment guaranteed black men the constitutional right to vote. So the 15th Amendment was in 1870, and the 14th Amendment was in 1868. African Americans actively took up the rights, opportunities, and responsibilities of citizenship during Reconstruction. 700 African American men served in elected public office, among them two United States senators and 14 members of the United States House of Representatives. Man, these brothers are moving up quick. Um, Another 1,300 African American men and women helped appointed government jobs. Okay, let me skip down to this. Listen to this though. From the late 1860s, this is the end of the 1860s, white supremacists in the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, terrorized African Americans, African American leaders, and citizens in the South until 1871. The U.S. Congress passed legislation that resulted in the arrest and imprisonment of leaders, and the end of terrorism of the American for a time. Now we understand that in 1920, in Stone Mountain, Georgia, the Ku Klux Klan revitalized. They came back with a vengeance. Their numbers grew. They burned a cross on Stone Mountain in 1920, and that's where they revitalized. That's a lot of times Georgia. When I lived in Georgia, I noticed that Georgia likes to hide their information on their part in slavery and lynchings. But in Stone Mountain in 1920, that's when the Klan revitalized. Okay, but over the course of the late 1860s and throughout the 70s, the federal government military presence was withdrawn from various southern states. And with the compromise of 1877, President Rutherford B. Hayes ordered the last federal troops in the South to withdraw. Okay, with no troops on 14th and 15th amendments, the Reconstruction was at an end across the South. Lynching, disenfranchisement, and segregation laws proliferated. It would not be until the Second World War, until the 1960s civil rights movement, that Jim Crow segregation would be outlawed. So that's what I wanted to bring up right there. From 1877 into 1960, right? Because the whole concept is Juneteenth, right? We're talking about Juneteenth. And why am I reading all that? Because the conversation now becomes, were we really freed? Let me read this again, and let me read this slower after I said this. But over the course of the late 1860s, right? Remember, the Klan terrorized until 1871. And throughout the 70s, the federal government military presence was withdrawn from various southern states with the compromise of 1877. President Rutherford B. Hayes ordered the last federal troops in the South to withdraw. With no troops to enforce the 14th, 15th Amendments. What are the 14th and 15th Amendments? Do we remember what those were? Okay, the 14th Amendment was guarantee African Americans rights of American citizenship, and the 15th with men to vote. So basically, without those two, you weren't even American citizenship. Now you weren't an American citizen. So with no troops to enforce those across the South, lynchings, disenfranchisement, and segregationist laws blew up. They proliferated. They were not involved. So there was nobody to stop this, right? it would not be into the Second World War, into the 1960s civil rights movement, that Jim Crow segregation would be outlawed. Now, this goes back to the conversation of Juneteenth and us getting so hype on Juneteenth. And we have to realize that when they gave you so-called freedom, which was never really freedom, okay? Let's actually look up something. What is freedom? Now, this is the definition, okay? The power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. Okay? The state of not being imprisoned or enslaved. Absent of subjection to foreign domination or government. So now I ask you a question. From 1965, were blacks ever really free? And when did they get free? Because you have to look at what freedom really means. The power or right to speak or to think as one wants without the hindrance of restraint. The state of not being imprisoned or enslaved. Do you think in 1866, if a white man will walk up to a black man will walk up to a white man who were doing wrong and told him he was doing wrong and he ain't nothing, do you think that he had the right to say that without nothing happening to him? Without his house being burned, his church being burned, without him being strung up and hung, without his wife being raped? Remember, from late 1860s through the 70s, even in the South, the militaries walked out. They basically doing what they doing in Atlanta and not responding to calls. And it wasn't until the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, that then basically they were held accountable for what they were doing. 100 years later. So when we talk about Juneteenth and freedom, we have to be realistic and say, were we free? The answer is no. Yeah, you can go to the movies, you can go to the Baltimore Ravens games, you can go to the Cleveland Indians games, the Cavs games. Yeah, you can sit on the front of the bus. But look what happened to Breonna Taylor and his brother who tried to defend her. Look what happened to these brothers who's been hung, 4 of them. Look what's happened to these brothers out here who, when we know that we the Israelites and we're not getting recognized and we're not being allowed to do what we're supposed to do. There is a level of realizing that there has been a pacification going on. They'll give you a few celebrities, but the reality is blacks are still last in almost all statistical categories and everything bad. They the number one. School systems, education, health, diabetes, heart problems. I think that we have to really look at the word freedom and understand what that meant. Juneteenth is an incredible day. It's an incredible day because when we go to court, we can always resort back to that day and say, according to this day, according to your own laws in America, that's when we were free. But the power to act or to speak or think as one wants without the hindrance of restraint. Can a black man truly protect his family here in 2020? No. The absence of subjection to foreign domination or government. The government have the right to basically come into your house, pass laws to do whatever they want, and you have nothing to defend yourself with. That's true. The state of not being in prison or enslaved. You're not free, family. You're not free. You can't get overly caught up with this illusion that you can do whatever you want. You can't. Look at the brother that's being hung. Look at the brothers that's being in these chokeholds by the police. They're being slaughtered and killed. So I just think that we have to be mindful on when we say Juneteenth, we realize that we're still in a war. We're still battling. We're still fighting to be free. We have nothing to protect ourselves. We have no connection back to Africa or Israel. We have no connection. If something happens to us, there's nothing from our country that comes and defends us. That's not freedom. If I wanted to say, you know what? I want to go. What do? We just randomly pick up and go to whatever state. It would be nice if they say, you know what, we took you, we owe it to you to tell you and give you back your history. So you know where to go to and have a connection to a family somewhere over there. You're left alone. You're left stripped. I just wanted to make this today, man. I know it was just random readings, but it was all to let you know what freedom was. These people came out of slavery and weren't able to read. They weren't allowed to read. They weren't allowed education. So when they first got out, what do you think that life was for them? They couldn't read. White people hated them. The white people didn't have the skill sets. The black people were the blacksmith. The black people were the cooks. The black people had all the skill sets. They couldn't read. Do you think that these white people were mad because they didn't know how to do anything because they weren't used to doing it? The black people ran it. So now, how do you think that these white men felt that their women were probably saying, go to him, he know how to do it? And yet you can't now treat him the way you used to legally. Hatred, animosity, frustration. Now it's competition. Now I have to come up with a way to exert my dominance over you. I better get it before you get it. Think about the laws of when they were freed. They couldn't read. How were they going to get jobs? Who was going to hire them fairly? Yeah, I'll hire you if I can still treat you like a damn slave. So yeah, man, this is Black Man's Thoughts, man. I wanted to cut this short. I just thought that, it would behoove me to say something about Juneteenth. Do I celebrate it? I acknowledge it. I acknowledge it. I celebrate the law, statutes, and commandments of the Most High, the Creator. I celebrate his feast days, my cultural feast days, because I got them when I was free. As a free man, I didn't have to beg. I didn't have to beg somebody to give them to me. These was when I was a free man. I was given a Torah when I was a free man. And as a free man, I freely exercise my right to say, you know what? I choose to follow the law, statutes, and commandments of the Father. I choose to say, I'm going to keep these feast days. This is an acknowledgement in the obvious that I decided to make. So those are the days that I'm going to acknowledge. Nothing else. But, to follow, nothing else. But all praise to the Creator that he allowed us to, by law, on this day, can pinpoint to that. So if we go to court, we can say to that day. But Leviticus 23, that's what I follow. This is Black Man's Thoughts, man. Much love to y'all. Shalom, shalom.